we've been kicking the can down the road for a couple of decades now, going from bubble to bubble. And that includes when Trump was president the first time. I remember when I voted for Trump, I was hoping that maybe he would actually be able to cut government. And the fact that he wasn't a politician, he would not behave like one. I was wrong on that. But he ran on a platform of cutting government, reducing government spending. He had something called his penny plan. He was going to cut, every year he was president, he was going to cut spending by a penny, 1 penny out of every dollar, which wasn't even enough. But of course, he didn't do that. He ended up increasing spending by 4 cents on the dollar for the first 3 years. That's, not counting COVID. If you count COVID, it was something like 16 cents a year because spending blew up so much in 2020. But even before we got to COVID, government spending was going up under Trump. The deficits he talked about paying off the national debt as a candidate. He ran up a lot of debt. The debt went up 50%. The budget deficits went up 50% in his first 3 years before they, went through the roof during COVID. So he did end up setting the record, which Biden just broke, for the most amount of debt added in one presidential term. So he expanded government. In fact, even when the Republicans had both houses of Congress, they increased welfare spending in addition to warfare spending. He added a department. He added the Space Force. He didn't eliminate a single agency or department. I think that now we're in much worse shape. The economy is far worse than it was in 2016. That's why he won by a wider margin. And the reason he won the first time, and the reason I predicted he was going to win the first time, and I predicted again, is that I knew the economy was much worse than the media was portraying, and the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. And the same thing is true now. We have a horrible economy beneath the surface. And Trump just showing up is not going to fix these problems. And neither will simply cutting taxes the way he has advocated, because most of the taxes are not really growth oriented. They're consumption oriented. You're cutting taxes on overtime, on tips, on Social Security benefits. So all this money is just going to be spent. And since we already have record trade deficits, the trade deficit we had last month, merchandise trade deficit, was the worst in history, with the exception of 1 month right after we did the COVID reopening. But we've never been more dependent on imports than we are right now. And if we just give people a bunch of taxes, they're going to spend more money on imports. Now, yes, the imports will get more expensive because Trump is going to put tariffs on those imports, but we're still going to import them because we don't have the ability to produce the stuff ourselves. We're just going to have to import more and pay higher prices with the tariffs. But the other problem is the tax cuts are going to blow a big hole in it already, more than $2 trillion a year deficit. When Trump came to office in 2016, the annual deficit spending was about $650 billion officially. Now it's well over $2 trillion a year officially. And when Trump came to office the first time, the Fed funds rate was 0.5%. Now it's 4.5%. And the yield on the 10-year was 2.5%. Now it's, getting close to 4.5%. But rates are moving up a lot higher. So we're going to have much higher interest rates with much bigger debt. And Trump is talking about mass deportations, which, I'm all for having a strict border. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that most of the jobs created under Biden were for illegals. That's kind of where they came from. If we kick them out, who's going to do that work? And what are we going to have to pay Americans to come off of welfare and take those jobs? Yeah, sure. There are some people who are on welfare that will kick out, and there's some criminals, and that'll be good. But I think overall, we're going to actually do more harm, because we're going to deplete our labor supply, and that's going to further, drive up the cost of production in the United States. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. And remember, the underlying problem with the country is that we spend and borrow too much and consume too much. And inflation, which wasn't as big a problem when Trump won in 2016, is a huge problem now, because all the chickens have come home to roost, all the QE, 1, 2, 3, all that, COVID. Now we're dealing with it. That's why Trump got elected, because inflation was really bad. That was harming people, but it's going to get worse because his policies are all highly inflationary, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Fed to monetize these exploding deficits. So I think the markets have got it wrong, to think the dollar's going up, gold's going down, Bitcoin is surging because they think they're going to have a Bitcoin reserve. They're going to make Bitcoin profits tax-free. I mean, I certainly hope they don't do something that stupid. But if they do that, that's also highly inflationary, because where do they think the money's going to come from to buy Bitcoin? They got to print it. So it's just more government spending, except they're spending it on nothing. They're spending it to make people who own Bitcoin richer at the expense of people who don't. The real tax that the government imposes on society is what it spends. And so that's spending. So that's taxation. So right now, the U.S. government spends about $7 trillion a year. So that's the tax on the economy. Now, what Trump ran on was cutting income taxes. Okay, but if you're not going to cut spending, you haven't cut taxes. So what Trump really wants to do is replace the income tax partially with tariffs, but he's pretended that Americans don't pay the tariffs, that the Chinese do or the Russians, which is not true. The tariffs are on Americans, not on anybody else. But the tariffs aren't big enough to offset all the tax cuts that he's promised so many people to get elected. And so we end up paying for government with more inflation. That's what he doesn't want to say. And in fact, when all the Republicans, including Trump, blame Biden for all this inflation, they bear a lot of the responsibility. Trump pointed out, and the Republicans, that you're getting inflation because of all the deficit spending under Biden. Well, we had big deficit spending under Trump. Why doesn't that count? The thing is that the deficit spending and the money printing when Trump was president, we didn't see the effects on prices until Biden was president. And so what we've really had over these last few years is the Trump inflation. Wait till we catch up to the Biden inflation. That's still coming because there's a lag here between printing all that money.
Let's talk about
the effect
that.
It has on prices. I've always put more blame on the Fed for enabling the policy. And now, not only does the Fed enable the policy, but Powell refuses to criticize the policy. I mean, Powell is hanging, behind this supposed independence of the Fed to say that we can't even speak critically of the government. That's not what an independent Fed is. Independent Fed doesn't mean that you don't criticize the government and you don't comment on fiscal policy. An independent Fed means that you are free to criticize the government and to comment on their fiscal policy when you think it's bad. That's why the central banker is supposed to be independent. But to say, we're independent, so we have to keep our mouths shut. We can't talk about any mistakes that we believe the government is making. We can't comment on the deficits, that is sheer nonsense. And if you go back to Paul Volcker, who everybody agrees was a good Fed chairman, he was very critical of the government. He didn't have any of this BS that he couldn't comment on fiscal policy. He commented on it all the time. You got to remember that the inflation is the expansion of the money supply. So rather than looking at the CPI under Trump, you got to look at the money supply under Trump and see what was going on there. Because price increases are the lagged effect of that inflation. And also, inflation can prevent prices from falling. Falling prices are a good thing, right? It makes things less expensive. Everybody wins. But inflation can prevent prices from falling. That doesn't mean it's not doing harm. It's making things cost more than they otherwise would have. But we were going to get a lot higher inflation even if we didn't have the pandemic, based on the policies not only of Trump, but on the policies of Obama, who preceded Trump. The Fed was doing QE1, QE2, QE3, and they didn't even start raising interest rates really until after Trump was elected. So, by the time he got into office, there had been 2 hikes, but I think both of them were after the election. And so up until the time, really, Obama left, rates were still at 0. And of course, they quickly returned to 0 later in his presidency once COVID hit. But I think the reason that you're not going to see the low rates of CPI that we saw during his first term is all the pent-up inflation is now surfacing, right? All the years of money printing is now showing up, in consumer prices. And I think that is going to accelerate, especially when the Fed goes back to quantitative easing, which I believe they will, because I think that the only way that they can stop long-term rates from rising is to go back to quantitative easing. Right now, they're still doing quantitative tightening. They've tapered it a bit. But, ever since the Fed cut interest rates, now they've cut interest rates 75 basis points, long-term rates are up almost that much. And they're going to keep rising, especially if people expect this, stronger economy under Trump. Well, if we have, even if the Fed is able to reduce the short-term rates to 4%, there's no reason that 10-year shouldn't be 6%. But the problem is the economy can't handle those higher rates. The mortgage market, everything would buckle if the Treasury got up to 6%. And I think a lot more banks would fail because the banking system is very insolvent right now, thanks to all the low-yielding debt that they own, that they accumulated when rates were at 0. The Fed averted another financial crisis when they stopped hiking rates last time and they bailed out like Signature Bank and Silicon Valley Bank, or a few banks that failed. A lot more would have failed had the Fed not stepped up. But the whole system is insolvent. So I think the Fed is going to be forced to go back to quantitative easing because the rate cuts are not going to be enough. But the Fed is going to be going back to quantitative easing as inflation is picking up. That's why at the last press conference, a reporter asked Powell, hey, what's your plan for stagflation? And the answer was to laugh it off and say, well, our plan is to hope we don't have it. They know there is no plan because there's nothing they can do, but that's exactly where we're headed. I think we're already there. The Fed just doesn't want to admit it. It's just going to get worse, and it's not going to go away under Trump. We need some serious structural reforms in the economy. And the only way we can get them is if we stop spending and borrowing. The whole time the Fed was supposedly fighting inflation with tight money continued to be loose because debt went to all-time record highs. Government debt, all-time record highs, household debt, credit card debt, record highs, trade deficit, record highs, budget deficit, record highs. Everybody is borrowing and spending despite the rate hikes, which proves that the Fed stopped too early. They never raised rates high enough to do the job. They never actually got into restrictive territory. In order to restructure the economy in a way to have sound economic growth, we need much higher interest rates. We need a lot more savings. We can't have record low savings. People have to stop buying stuff on credit. But Trump wants to add more air to the bubble. He wants us to get tax cuts and keep spending. And so that can't solve the problem. To solve the problem, we require the opposite of what he campaigned on. We need some austerity. We need to tighten our belts. We need to concentrate on cutting government spending and not just waste, fraud, and abuse. Everybody is in favor of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. The problem is you can never identify too much of it because there's a constituency behind all that waste, fraud, and abuse that doesn't want it to end. So you can never really make much headway. Even Ronald Reagan couldn't get spending cut. He campaigned on, we're going to eliminate the Department of Energy. We're going to eliminate the Department of Education. Well, they're still here. So people get all excited because of all these promises. It doesn't happen. Congress doesn't deliver. When I ran for Senate, I said, look, I'm going to slash spending. And one of the things I said I wanted to do is I wanted to lead the filibuster in the Senate to block raising the debt ceiling. I didn't want any more debt. And I wanted to use that to force the government to cut spending. But they didn't do it. I used to support this coalition to cut government spending. I think they're still around, but nobody cares. Governments, by definition, are never going to be efficient. In order to be efficient, you need free market forces. So Elon Musk bought Twitter. It was his company, and he said, okay, I'm going to cut costs, I'm going to fire people, because it was his money at stake. Right? So when you have a private enterprise that is guided by profit and loss, and then you have competitive market forces, you have efficiency because the inefficient companies are driven out of business by the efficient companies. And because the people that own businesses don't want to lose their money, so they try to be efficient. Governments are not subjected to those forces, right? When you're in Congress, none of it is your money, right? It's all taxpayer money. And your motivation is actually to spend as much of it as possible because that's the source of your power, right? And there's no competition. Government isn't under a competitive threat because you got to buy government services whether you like it or not. They take taxes whether you want to pay it or not. So you don't have market forces. It's actually the opposite. Governments are incentivized to spend as much as possible because, you look at these governments, their budgets, if they don't spend everything, their budget gets cut. So a lot of times at the end of the year, any money they haven't spent, they just rush out and spend it because they want to make sure they get their share of the pie in the following year. So if Elon Musk gets in there, he's going to find it's very, very difficult to actually cut. But if you look at the stuff that's off the table, that's, 80% of the government that they're not even going to touch, right? Which is national defense, which they still want to increase, interest on the debt, which is on autopilot going up at a rapid pace, right? 1.1 trillion. In another year and a half, it'll be 2 trillion a year interest on the debt, right? They can't stop that. That's just going way up. They won't even be able to cut enough in discretionary spending to offset the increase in the cost of the national debt all by itself. But then you got Social Security and Medicare that are skyrocketing in cost. Those are off the table. In fact, so is Obamacare, Medicare. He didn't talk about any cuts to health care. So that's most of the budget. And then what's left? If you look back at the history of government, I'm 61 years old, and I remember so many attempts, usually led by Republicans, to cut spending. And it never happens. Sometimes they pass these bills that call for spending cuts 3, 4 years, 5 years in the future that never materialize because before we get there, they can get rid of it. Trump won the House and the Senate in 2016. He had everything for those first 2 years, and they increased government spending. They didn't cut government spending. They did cut taxes. I have no doubt in my mind that they're going to cut taxes again. And the tax cuts we're going to get this time are going to be much bigger than the ones that we got last time because he's going to extend all the original tax cuts, right? So we get that tax cut all over again. Because right now, if you look at the projections that the government has for future deficits, they assumed that the tax cuts don't get extended, right? So that's part of the budget. So the minute they extend them, right, you blow out the CBO's estimates. But they want to bring back the SALT deduction that they took out the first time. And they want to make corporate rates even lower. So it's going to be a bigger tax cut when we're already more broke. The national debt, when he comes in, is going to be well over 36 trillion, maybe 37 trillion. When he came in the first time, it was still under 20 trillion. Not that that was small, but America is more broke now, right? Yet we want to let the taxpayer off the hook with even more tax cuts when they should be having tax hikes, unless we're going to, slash spending, which we're not going to do. But in addition to all those, he never talked on the campaign trail the first time about exempting Social Security from taxes. That's a huge increase in Social Security benefits. He never talked about no tax on tips or no tax on overtime or no tax for teachers, no tax for firefighters or policemen or veterans. I mean, you're talking about an enormous amount of money. Yes, he's promising tariffs, but we still have the old tariffs. The tariffs he put in initially, most of them are still there. Biden never got rid of them. Now, those tariffs didn't turn the economy around before. They didn't even turn our trade deficit around. We have record trade deficits with those tariffs. The trade deficits didn't go down. We didn't bring manufacturing home. We've been in a manufacturing recession for years. And so the tariffs aren't going to change that. They may even worsen that. There's a lot of problems that everybody is overlooking with all the euphoria, particularly market euphoria. Because again, the markets get way ahead of itself because, the markets will do anything if people are betting on it, right? Money is flooding in, but they're betting on something that's not going to happen.